Hello viewers, welcome to today's program. The topic of today's program is Introduction to Psychology, Major Perspectives and Research Methods. Myself Professor Swati Patra and with me Dr. Monica Misra from Discipline of Psychology, School of Social Sciences, IGNOU. The topic today relates specifically to the General Psychology course of BA Psychology program, and it will also be helpful for the master's degree students of psychology. Now, let us see what all we will discuss today in this program of today. We will cover about the following objectives. We will cover about the history of psychology, the research, the perspectives, the major perspectives. What are the major perspectives in psychology? Then we will talk about the research in psychology. What are the steps of research in psychology? We will also talk about what are the research methods that are used in conducting research in psychology. And also, we will focus on the ethical guidelines that needs to be followed while conducting research in psychology. So, let us start with today's discussion. First, we will be covering the history of psychology and major perspectives of psychology, which will be discussed by Dr. Monica. And then I will be discussing the research in psychology. So, Monica?
Yeah, thank you, Swati. Just because since you have already just mentioned about that we'll be taking up the major schools and the major perspectives that are prevailing in psychology, let me just revisit the definition of psychology as it is taken today. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So this means that both the overt and the covert processes, that is whatever is observed and what is for example, the higher order mental functioning, etc., which cannot be observed, they are both are the subject of study. And in psychology, it is, for example, not only the human behavior, but the animal behavior is also studied. So the overt and the covert, the animal and the human behavior, everything comes into perspective. Secondly, important aspect is today psychology is referred to as the hub science. This is so because more or less whatever surrounds you, mostly all the psychological principles per se, they are applicable. For example, in health sector, or say for example town planning, and for example climate change. Now everywhere the psychological principles are being applied for sustainable development. So as such, it is now referred to as a hub science. So psychology as such, it was earlier a part of philosophy, and it's been now, say for example, it is 138 years since it evolved as a distinct discipline separate from philosophy. And of course, in India, it was introduced in the year 1916 with the first department established in Calcutta University, and Narendranath Sen Gupta as the who established the first lab in India. So as such, today, the mind and body interaction, and slowly it has evolved. It was earlier a part of philosophy, and now it has very well established as a distinct discipline. So now let us just see how the traditional schools have existed and the ones that are coming up. For example, when we say that it has been 138 years of psychology, it is as such as a distinct discipline. But when we see the works, when we read the works of Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and even Descartes and all, they have the psychological underpinnings. And when Socrates says, know thyself, so this is about knowing oneself with the help of the method of introspection. And when Aristotle writes Peripsyche, which is referred to as about the psyche 2000 years ago, it means how the individual is governed, the behavior is governed by rules and laws. And people always, they seek pleasure and avoid pain. So somehow we are seeing that the psychological underpinnings are there in the works from ancient times. Then as we proceed further, we see the first experimental, systematically how experiments were conducted in classical psychophysics by Fechner, whose major focus was on perception and with the elements of psychophysics. And this was the first systematic way of conduction of experiments. And then in the year 1879, the first psychology lab, was established in Leipzig by Wundt. Now, Wilhelm Wundt, and we'll just see how this school flourished in the early 1900s. So, this is the way psychology, as a part of philosophy, it emerged as a distinctive discipline. When we talk about the major perspectives in psychology, it is the traditional schools of psychology first, and this is starting with structuralism. Now, structuralism was the first organized school of thought in psychology, and the major proponents were Wilhelm Wundt and his student Titchener. The main method of their study was objective introspection, and they basically focused on the building blocks of consciousness. The consciousness was primarily it was sensation and feeling, and sensation primarily it comes from, of course, from the sense organs like eyes and ears and so on, while as the feeling component is primarily with reference to the emotions like fear, anger, love, etc. So, in the initial years, of course, structuralism was flourishing, but later on it faded, and then we see the emergence of functionalism as a major school, and the main proponent was William James. Now, William James' Principles of Psychology was the seminal work, and today also it is in print, it is in so much demand. William James also, it is like structuralism, it focused on the how and the what, but functionalist, they focused on the why the behavior occurs, how the mind adapts. And he was a professor in Harvard University, and that was the first university to open psychology in US. And in fact, he established the first lab in US. Then we have the Gestalt approach or the Gestalt perspective, and the major proponents in the Gestalt approach are Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler. Again, here the focus is primarily on perception. The principle underlying is the whole is greater than the sum of its part. So, as such, the perception was the major focus of their experiments and their research, and which today itself it is the base of an important branch of psychology, that is cognitive psychology. In fact, Gestalt principles are being applied in psychotherapy as well, and we have the Gestaltist therapy as well, the psychotherapy. Then we have psychoanalysis, and many of us are well aware of Sigmund Freud, the main proponent of this school of thought. And Freud published The Ego in 1927, and it is the psychodynamic nature of the push and pull interaction of the conscious and the unconscious. So that is the individual tries to repress or the push back the undesired memories and the desires into the unconscious. So there was, of course, overemphasis of sex and sexual motivation we see, but Freudian principles per se and the psychoanalysis as it is known as has been of tremendous application in the psychotherapeutic intervention also, where primarily the techniques are dream interpretation and free talk. Then we see the emergence of behaviorism, and where we see Watson, Hull, Skinner, Thorndike, where the focus is on learning and it is primarily the observed behavior. Here also it is a kind of a stimulus-response association. Every stimulus has a response. So that was the major focus, and anything that is observable is the point of focus here from the behavioristic perspective. And the behavioristic principles are also applied. See, these schools also, these thoughts, these perspectives also have a wider application when it comes to in therapy. So the behavioristic principles are also applied to the psychotherapeutic intervention. Then when we come on to the recent perspectives, the recent development has been on the evolutionary perspective, where when Charles Darwin gives his theory of survival of the fittest and natural selection, how the person or the individual has evolved, the evolution of species has some way it is determining the universal mental characteristics. For example, why are people afraid of snakes, or why people lie? And so this evolutionary perspective, the psychologists working from this perspective give focus on this particular aspect. Biological perspective is another important perspective, which of course is also referred to by other names like biopsychological also, where as such there is an association between the biological system, the brain and the nervous system. There is the electrical and the chemical activity of the brain, the mental processes, the behavior, and the interaction between hormones, heredity, mental processes, and the behavior on one hand. And there are various techniques that are used in the study. And for example, with the advent of the technology coming in, like the PET, the MRI scan, the fMRI, the researchers have been able to, identify the different parts of the brain which are responsible for, say, for example, language or mathematics or music. And as such, of course, endocrine system also. The endocrine system also is an important part from this perspective, and the association between the endocrine system and the behavior is also established. So we see how the biology, the biological systems, they are impacting the psychological makeup of an individual. Then we have the socio-cultural perspective. This focuses on the relationship between the social behavior and culture. In fact, we have two distinct branches of psychology, primarily the social psychology and cultural psychology. It is little overlapping, and hence, like how the individual behaves in a crowd, the group dynamics, the norms, and everything from a social cultural perspective, it is researched and studied. We can give an important example here is by Levi Gotsky, who gave an important a theory on cognitive development of children from a socio-cultural Then again, we have the humanistic existential perspective. Here, the main proponents are Maslow and Rogers, and where we have given importance to the human capacity, the free will, and it is just the opposite of what Freud had earlier proposed, not at all deterministic in nature. And we also see that this is also known as the third force of psychology. And we also see that the humanistic principles, the existential principles, how they are today applied to the psychotherapeutic interventions in treating psychological problems. Psychodynamic perspective is another emergent perspective that, of course, this was different from what Freud has initially suggested. There was less emphasis on sex and sexual motivation. It was more on the self-direction, the choice, the free will, and the main proponents of this school of thought were Jung, Adler, Karen Horney, Erik Erikson. So this is something different from what Freud principles were. Then again, we have another latest one that is coming up, that is, and a lot of research is being conducted on from the cognitive perspective. As such, we see in Gestalt that there is focus on perception. We see here in cognitive that the higher order processes like learning, memory, thinking, decision making, etc., they are the main focus of study. And with cognitive neuroscience and with the advent of computers, this perspective is emerging as an important a perspective where now not only in India but also not only abroad but also in India, researchers are being from cognitive perspectives, and separate institutions are being established on brain research as such. Here we see that how from the part of the philosophy and the traditional schools like structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalysis and behaviorism, how it has evolved itself, taking into the biological, the social and the cultural perspective, the cognitive perspective. As such, this is the status. Swati, I think it would be now let our viewers know about how research is being done in psychology.
Yes, sure. So viewers, now you have seen that what are the major perspectives in psychology. Now, whatever be the perspective, research in psychology always follows a scientific method. Okay, that is why we say that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And as in any other science, there are 4 primary goals of research here. That is to describe, to predict, to control, and to explain. In other words, it describes what is the phenomenon, what it is. Then it says when it will occur. Then it answers what causes it to occur, and then it explains why does it occur. For example, like if you talk about like what is the psychosocial development or what is the emotional development in the case of adolescents, or how the cognitive development happens in the case of preschool children. So it describes the phenomenon. It also answers why does it occur, like why stress is caused, why do we forget, for example, in a stressful situation, or for example, what is the relationship between self-esteem and academic achievement. So these four goals, that is to describe, to predict, to control and explain, these are the main goals of research when we talk of research in psychology. Now, there are different steps in research. Okay, how do we go about doing or conducting a particular research? Now, here first we start with formulating a research problem or a research question. For this, we need to find out what are the research gaps in the existing research, knowledge field. Now, for example, if I say, let us take the same example of the adolescents. For example, there is this psychology of adolescence. Now we know that we study the stress and the adjustment pattern among the adolescents. Now suppose the research is lacking throwing light on the aspect of emotional intelligence, how it is contributing to stress and academic achievement, how emotional intelligence is mediating between these two. Suppose this is a research gap in this particular area. Now, as a researcher, you may like to focus on this research gap and formulate your research question accordingly. So, after you formulate a research problem or research question, then the next step will be to decide the research design or the study design. This is crucial. This is almost like a blueprint of how you want to go about the research study. It covers what are the research methods that you will be taking up. It covers what are the sampling techniques that you will follow, the type of tools that you will be taking. So research design is very crucial. It will depend on the objectives, on the research, on the nature of your research question that you have formulated. And then after that, you are formulating specific objectives. So from your research question, which is a general statement, you are coming to the specific objectives. And then you are formulating hypothesis in respect of these objectives. Now after this, after you formulate your objectives and hypothesis, you go on collecting data, that is systematically observing the facts in the field or data collection. After you collect the data, the next step will be analyzing the data and testing the hypothesis that you have proposed, and then you interpret the findings. Then the end result of the entire research process will be generalizing the findings, or it may be the formulating a theory, or it may be testing the theory. So we see that in a research, we start with a general proposition, with a general area. As I gave you the example like psychology of adolescence, then we come to the specific, the objectives of the particular research study, that is finding out the emotional intelligence, or doing a study on the stress or academic achievement of the adolescents. And then again we are going back to the general field or generalizing the findings to the population. So research progresses from a general, then coming to the specific, and then again going back to the general field. Okay. Now next step, let us see what are the types of research that we conduct here in psychology field. When we talk about the types of research, it can be categorized based on different criteria, mainly three criteria. One is what are the applications of research. So based on the applications of research, we can have pure research as well as applied research. Based on the objectives, we can have descriptive, correlational and explanatory research, and based on mode of inquiry, we can have quantitative, qualitative research and mixed mode of research. So these are the different types of research. So pure research will be, which is theoretical research, where we do the research study to enhance the knowledge with regard to the research methods in the field. Whereas applied research will be finding out the applications of the theoretical knowledge in the field. Okay. For example, if you see the effectiveness of mindfulness therapy for depression or anxiety, okay, that is application based. Now, the second type of research is based on the objectives, that is descriptive research, correlational research and explanatory research. Descriptive research, as the term indicates, it is describing the phenomenon. Now, it consists of the observation studies, and then we have case study, and then we have self-report methods. Now, next is the correlational research, that is assesses the relationship between two variables. Here I would like to point out that correlational studies give a relationship status. Whereas in the next this thing, that is experimental research, here we focus on the causality. So correlation is not causality. Correlation may predict the possibility of a cause and effect relationship, but it doesn't prove a causal relationship. Whereas experimental research focuses on finding out the cause and effect relationship. Now, next is based on the mode of inquiry, we can have the types of research as quantitative research, which is more structured, objective, and qualitative research, which is more of unstructured and subjective in nature, and it focuses on perception, meanings, and feelings and experiences of the participants. So finally, like when we have discussed all these research methods, then we can focus on the ethics in research, because ethics is a very important part while conducting research. We focus on the confidentiality of the data collected, we focused on the informed consent, and our major focus is on the welfare of the participants. So as to conclude here, I would say that research in any discipline is always done with responsibility. And in psychology, it becomes all the more crucial that because it deals with living beings. So that is why utmost care needs to be taken to follow the ethical guidelines while conducting research. And now I think there are some reference books here you can refer to for knowing more about the perspectives of psychology and research methods in psychology. And then if you have any query, you can always contact us in this email ID, psychology@ignou.ac.in. Thank you.
Thank you.